Okay, hello everyone who has stuck around through the final wrap-up panel. And we appreciate you being here. And so we have, by consensus, as NATO and the European Union works, decided that we are going to make very, very short opening remarks, opening questions, and then we would very much like you all to participate because the room is packed and it's much more exciting to hear from you than to hear from us because we've already talked and gotten out some of our questions for each other. So I'm going to start to the left of me, as those of you who've been here since morning already know Slovak Foreign Minister Miroslav Lajčák. And he has had a very, very busy schedule. In the 24 hours before both of us flew from Brussels, he was running the Afghanistan conference in some parts, meeting the Kazakhs, meeting the Georgians, and he says all in a day's work for the current EU Council President. To his left, Ana Palacio, former Spanish foreign minister, and on the boards of, I couldn't even count all the companies, ranging from pharmaceuticals to the Atlantic Council to the World Bank, a very busy lady. Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who most people will remember as the Secretary General of NATO from 2009 to 2014, presiding over the alliance at a time when it was operational in 6 theaters on 3 continents. If I recall, including notables like Afghanistan and Libya. So he's seen it all. Russia took over Crimea during his time at the helm. So he certainly has seen a lot of the evolution on Russia in Brussels. And finally, Ambassador Peter Westmacott, who is, of course, a very special guest on this panel, being our Brexit analyst. So I'm going to start with the minister. Okay. And first of all, I warned you I was going to ask, are you relieved or disappointed about the UN Secretary General race? And that's not my real question.
Honestly, more relieved than disappointed. I'm happy it's over. It was extremely difficult. And I did pretty well, so I have no reasons to be. I promise that I will do my best not to embarrass Slovakia, and I believe I did not, so I'm okay.
He came in just after Antonio Guterres, so I would say that's an extremely good showing. And as Damon mentioned earlier, I think it was you said, I think Europe is relieved to have you go back home instead of stay over here. But I would like to start with your country's 6-month presidency of the European Union, which was on July 1st, took over on July 1st, so right after the Brexit vote, yes, which is the reason for us being here. Will the European Union hold together after the Brexit vote? It was a tough time to take over the Council presidency under any circumstances, but people were nervous, both in Bratislava and Brussels. Sort of the snooty types in Brussels thought, can Slovakia handle the presidency? And Slovakia thought, hey, we got a lot of issues with this European Union thing, so how difficult is it going to be both presiding for 6 months and to have a lot of criticisms? One of the countries that has been very vocal in criticisms of migration policy, of employment policy, of many of the challenges that the bloc is facing now and which we have spoken about today. So first of all, I would like you to, with my brief privilege of question to each of my panelists, talk about how difficult it is to be both a critic and a practitioner of EU policy. And could I just mention, everybody, please tweet about us. It's stronger, #Stronger with Allies. I think I have the most exciting panel here, so I hope everybody else thinks so too.
I wouldn't exaggerate with Slovakia being a critic of the European Union. I see my own country and our government as a strongly pro-EU government. We know how much we have benefited from the membership in the European Union. We have played by the rules, and we have only dared to have a different opinion once, namely on the way how European Union was dealing with migration last year. Obviously, it created waves. How dare we to have a different opinion? But I believe that we proved to be right, because now the European Union is doing what we were saying right from the beginning. Let's start with the protection of external border, and let's see of what the number of politicians in the European Union, what they were saying a year ago and what they are doing now. And we didn't make any U-turn. The good thing is that the reasonable approach has prevailed in the European Union. For us, the presidency, of course, is a big challenge. And you know that no matter how long you plan for the presidency and how carefully you draft your priorities, in the end, you have to deal with something totally unexpected. In our case, of course, migration was the known unknown, to paraphrase of we know whom, and of course the Brexit. So this is the biggest issue, even though the practical steps. Negotiations with UK will start after our presidency, but the first shock of the Brexit and the accommodation of this new reality within the European Union was up to us. The Bratislava summit took place 3 weeks ago. But for us, we really believe that it's a good chance to show that we can do it, that we can be a good presidency. We are a small country, no vested interest, no hidden agenda, a real honest broker, and that's how we try to proceed. We have many challenges, but I really believe that the main challenge for the European Union will be whether the European leaders will show and will prove to be up to the task to deal with all these challenges, which I don't need to mention now.
You haven't dropped your lawsuit against the European Union on the migration quotas, though, have you? If things are going your way now?
But we have not created this instrument. It's normal. I mean, we are not the first country. It's, again, this...
you and Hungary.
Yeah, but, I mean, in the past, many other countries have turned to the European Court on a number of other issues, and it has never made headlines. And it's, again, this patronizing approach that how dare you new member states. You are supposed to sit and listen and agree with whatever. We've turned to the court on the procedural side, because it's really strange when you say that migration crisis is the biggest crisis that European Union has ever faced, and on the other hand, you deal with it at the level of ministers of interior. You don't even bother to convene the European Council, sure. And you adopt the European strategy through the qualified majority vote, so you don't even invest enough time into coming to a common position of the European Union. We don't believe that it is in accordance with treaties. So yeah, we asked the court to tell us whether this is in accordance or is not. And I don't really believe that there is a reason to be shocked. I mean, we have not introduced this mechanism. We are not the only ones. We are not the first. We are not the last to turn to the court. So it's normal.
It is very interesting for the audience. Slovakia and Hungary have gone to the court because they...
but separately.
Not only.
And
Hungary went not together.
And Hungary went on the substance, and we went on the procedure.
The migration quota, the European Union passed over the objections of several of its member states a forcible migration relocation policy, forcible on the EU governments. I guess the migrants have to sign up also. It's not going very well.
We just couldn't find it in the treaties where it's written that you have to accept according to some quotas or something. It's not in the treaties.
And so it's one of the very, very, if not the most divisive issue inside the European Union now. Brexit notwithstanding, this is a huge challenge.
Not anymore.
You don't think so?
No, we are past that stage. Now we are speaking the same language, we are focusing on the same issues, and it's much better now.
All right, that's good. Ana Palacio, you have spoken and you have written very often about the legitimacy of the EU, that the EU is lacking in legitimacy with the common EU citizen, and much of the discussion today has been a criticism of the European Union for not being able to connect with voters. And we know it's true, and I've seen millions and millions poured into PR campaigns in Brussels trying to connect EU policy to voters, to citizens, because of course they'll love the EU if they know what it's about, right? Right. So you have some ideas about how the institutions can actually connect with Europeans.
I would say that this is linked to what Mr. Lajcik was saying. We have to explain to the citizens that the treaty is one, and that you cannot pick and choose and say, because, and I'm speaking in Spanish, because Spain is benefiting from the cohesion funds or from the structural funds, you cannot say anything on this topic. No, I mean, like the treaty, as you say, and I think that this is the first thing, is to make the treaty one and understand what Europe is for. Now, the short answer that I would highlight is that the legitimacy of the European Union is functional. I mean, yes, at the origin there was this idea of peace to avoid a new bloodshed on the original members of this project. So essentially between France and Germany. But then progressively, the European Union, what for, was not for peace in Europe. This is a new, I mean, today we could analyze it in a different context with relation to Russia, but in a very different context, but not among member states. So the legitimacy of the European project was based that it's benefiting me, and this was implicit for a long time. After the crisis, this was broken. And there is no functional legitimacy.
The crisis being the economic crisis.
The economic crisis, yes. So citizens do not see what the benefit for them is in the Europe, what benefit is for them in the European Union.
But how do you make them feel
well,
that?
Now, having said that, the truth of the matter is that the big problem of legitimacy is between the governed and the government in the member states. So there is a big problem of populism, and this is in a certain way being pinned on Brussels. Blame it on Brussels is the motto, and I have been both sides of the fence. I have been in the scaffoldings of the European institutions, but also as a government. And you know, it's so easy to pin anything on the European Union. So yes, there is an issue on Europe. Europe, what for? What for? If it doesn't bring prosperity, if it just brings, this is the question that is being asked by the citizens. But this question is being infused and just used or by the governments to just put some of their blame, pin it on Brussels.
So if national governments are serious about wanting the European Union to have legitimacy, they need to go home after the council meetings and not say Brussels made me do the bad stuff. They need to go home and say we collectively decided by consensus or qualified majority that this is what we're going to do.
And sometimes it's not easy because, of course, we pin on the European Union, and as Spain, we also have this experience of defending the external borders in Ceuta and Melilla, which was a situation very difficult, and being blamed for just disrespect of human rights because we had what everybody has now. So there's these fences that everybody, this was against human rights and being criticized, and just because it's, the European Union is instrumentalized in many ways, and by all governments. I think that everybody is instrumentalized. So in the end, you cannot ask the citizen to just, no, wait, this is instrumentalizing, but you know, this is a good project. No, I think that if we go to Brexit, and I'm sure that the ambassador will touch upon this, there is a lot of, a lot to blame to the national governments.
Well, using language like instrumentalizing is one of the things we need to change. Who the hell knows what that means?
Well, you are right. I mean, that's a different thing. Yeah, we tend in Brussels to use a jargon that really nobody understands. But
try finding a soundbite in most of those speeches.
Yeah, well, then today blame it on English not being my mother tongue. In Spanish, everybody would understand what instrumental is in French or instrumentalizar in Spanish. Maybe in English it's not the case.
No, it is a good word, but we use it.
Using it. I think that we have to come clear, and we have to just, we cannot just blame the European Union on mistakes or on shortcomings or you know, for a government, the essential thing when you come back from and this you know that, from a European Council is they say, well, we were fantastic. We had a big success for me, Spain, or for me, France, or for me. No, I mean, it's impossible that everybody wins. This is not a zero-sum game, and we didn't win. We have to change this. And yes, of course, we have to review what Europe is for. I think that we have to be realistic, and in this issue of legitimacy, what Europe is for. And right now, there is no demand for more Europe from the citizens. Not even in the classical core areas of the internal market. Not even there. There is no appetite for more méthode communautaire. Again, it's a jargon, but for communitarizing, there is no appetite. We have to understand that this is not what citizens want, and we have to understand this. And of course, when you listen to the State of the Union, just this, State of the Union Juncker saying, well, I'm going to do roaming. This is low-hanging fruit, just trying to connect with these citizens. The institutions right now have a big task and a big challenge to find things that will make them look good with the citizens.
But I think that's actually a good one. Roam like at home is something that actually resonates with people.
Yeah, but the problem is that we could not deliver on this. Brussels could not deliver on this one.
Okay, so looking for an identity. Under your tenure at NATO, Crimea gave you that, didn't it? For the people asking why do we have NATO, certainly Russia has reminded everyone why why we need NATO. And the Atlantic Council, of course, makes that case constantly. Mr. Rasmussen, your time at NATO also saw the creation of the speeding up of the Rapid Reaction Force, which used to take something like a year to be anywhere. You started reforming those things, but still we have Russia becoming increasingly bold, threatening EU members, threatening, of course, the NATO allies. Constant buzzing of NATO airspace with aircraft with transponders off. And I've always been frustrated that people didn't make more of a big deal about that in headquarters at NATO, warning about the civilian disasters that could be at stake. Do you feel that everybody understands, everybody in the European Union and the United States also feel the threat that Russia has become, that Russia is continuing to become, and about which you made such a strong case at NATO, such a strong case that made people uncomfortable inside the corridors of NATO at times?
Yeah, I think more and more people understand that Russia has changed from being a strategic partner to being a strategic challenge. The Russian aggression against Ukraine has created a completely new security environment in Europe, and we have to adapt to that situation. First of all, by strengthening our territorial defense. That's exactly what we started immediately after Russia had illegally annexed Crimea into the Russian Federation. We started with the Spearhead force, as you mentioned. Other steps have been taken also at the Warsaw Summit in NATO. And in general, the Europeans should invest more in defense. They should live up to the pledge from the NATO summit in Wales in 2014, that is, within the next decade, to invest at least 2% of GDP in defense. Secondly, we should also maintain a firm stance vis-à-vis Russia. As much as Mr. Putin wants to be seen as a strongman, he also respects strong language and a strong position. He respects a demonstration of power, and that's exactly what we should do. And thirdly, we should also maintain our unity within the European Union, within NATO, and across the Atlantic. Because only then Mr. Putin will understand that confrontation doesn't pay, he has to cooperate, which I think should, of course, be the long-term goal to develop that partnership between Russia and the West, because we have a mutual interest.
And we should,
now,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a final word on the Brexit in that respect, because I took note of the fact that the EU leaders at their summit in Bratislava at least discussed the idea of creating new military headquarters in Brussels, strengthening the EU defense dimension. I have to be very blunt about it. This is definitely not the appropriate answer to the crisis of the EU. If you ask the Europeans in the street, what do you consider the main challenge? Definitely they would not answer military headquarters or a new EU army or whatever. Okay, if the Europeans will invest the 2% of GDP in defense, I would welcome that. But let's start there. Not by building new headquarters that would duplicate NATO work and just be a waste of resources. So I see this as an attempt to take advantage of the Brexit and promote certain ideas that shouldn't be the first answer to the current crisis.
And in the interest of full disclosure, we should say that Mr. Rasmussen, after leaving NATO, is now a special advisor to President Poroshenko of Ukraine. I think it's fair to mention that.
Yeah, an external foreign policy advisor to President Poroshenko, yes. That's not a secret.
No, it's not a secret, but we need to have it mentioned when we're talking about your positions now. And now moving on to Ambassador Westmacott. who has given the European Union now this sort of Dr. Seuss-like lexicon, not personally, your country, the lexicon of Brexit, Nexit, Swexit, no Slexits, no Slexits while presidency, Rasmussen has said there will not be a Daxit. He promised me that Denmark probably won't hold the referendum.
No, we'll stay, of course.
No. So, Ambassador, you have been quoted in an interview saying that Theresa May seems quite inclusive, and it was with public television here. Her first remarks after the Brexit, that she was quite inclusive, that perhaps people weren't expecting her to make speeches like this as a member of the Conservative Party, and then a couple of days ago it comes out that she actually wants all UK firms to list the foreigners who are working for them, something which has caused quite a firestorm among foreigners and Brits alike. CEOs writing on Twitter that they'd rather quit than list than international employees that they have. That doesn't sound very inclusive to me. And I'm not asking you to defend the present government's policies, but maybe you would have a reassessment of how Theresa May's leadership looks now?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here to comment a bit on this.
Sorry, I should welcome you too.
I think what this shows, and Theresa May's first reactions when she became Prime Minister, which happened to her within a couple of days when she was expecting it to take a couple of months to run a campaign. We move very quickly when we do political change in the United Kingdom. I think this was particularly inclusive because it showed that the result of the referendum for the British people was partly about Europe, but it was also partly about a lot of other issues which people were dissatisfied about. It's not entirely separate from the issues which are out there fueling, if you like, aspects of the Donald Trump campaign here. There are a lot of things that make people unhappy. There was a distrust of political elites. There was an anxiety about inequalities. There was a sense that globalization and free trade were not working for the losers as well as the winners. There were a lot of issues which were going on in the United Kingdom, and it's very clear to me, both the day she became Prime Minister and in her party conference speeches, and she's made 2 of them this last week, that Theresa May sees her assumption of the premiership in the UK not only as a responsibility to give effect in the best possible way to the Brexit referendum vote, but also to redirect the United Kingdom, our economy, our society. She wants to make it much more into a country which is for everybody to reach their maximum potential, not just the privileged few, as she talks about. And she goes on and on a number of occasions about ordinary working class people in a way that I suspect her predecessor would not have felt comfortable doing. So that's what I mean about being inclusive. She wants to reach out in a rather traditionally un-Tory way, unconservative way, to all the electors, all the disenchanted, all the people who are fed up with the way things have been going in the UK. So Europe was partly about this, and it was about sovereignty, it was about anxiety on immigration, an issue on which, in my personal judgment, several aspects of the campaign rhetoric were rather misleading, if not downright dishonest. It's unfortunate. But it was also about what was going on in the UK. And as we saw from the Pew Research Centre slides earlier today, the UK, oddly enough, is only about halfway down the league table in terms of popular disaffection with Brussels and the European institutions. So this is a bit of a wake-up call for Europe as a whole to get its act together. There's a certain irony in the fact that 2 of the biggest structural crises facing the European Union at the moment, which is the future of the Eurozone and the low growth and the high unemployment rates and the lack of a fiscal union that people were talking about, plus the migration crisis, are the 2 issues which, oddly enough, kind of directly affected the UK the least because of our own opt-out of Schengen and the fact that we're not part of the Eurozone and so on. But nevertheless, I think those are 2 of the big issues which are out there. Last point, one senior French politician said to me a little while ago, we really made a mess of our reaction to David Cameron's famous Bloomberg speech on the 23rd of January when he announced that there was going to be a referendum. And I thought this was going to be my French friend giving me yet another complaint about the Brits behaving badly or getting special treatment or not a bit of it. He said, we only focused on the British bit of that speech. We should have focused on the very sensible ideas David Cameron was making about the rest of Europe getting its act together in terms of transparency and accountability and efficiency and the democratic deficit. There's a lot that we need to do together. It's a shame that we now can't do it with you, but there were a lot of good things in that Cameron speech, and maybe it was a missed opportunity that we all focused a bit too much on giving him a manifesto with which he could go to the British people to campaign for Remain, and not enough on how the whole of Europe has issues to address. So when I say inclusive, That's part about the domestic politics. It's partly about the way she's seeing other issues, not just Europe. So I don't think I want to revise that judgment. I think we just need to see this in the round.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to open it to questions. Hands? Yes, and please identify yourself. We'll take 3 at a time, and please, if you have somebody specific on our panel that you want to address it to, or simply let anyone take a question, and stand up and identify yourself, and make it quick, please, so that we can get through a lot of people. And please remember to tweet #Stronger with Allies. Thank you.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much. My questions are for Secretary General Rasmussen and Sir Peter. My sense is that Brexit is going to have very negative strategic and political effects for the EU because we're going to lose a very, very sane voice inside the councils, but more importantly for NATO. It seems to me that Britain, when it does withdraw, has a number of problems. First, perceptually, the fact that Britain will be leaving the EU is going to hurt NATO, but more importantly, a £4 billion hole has been created in the British defense budget by what happened to the pound. And it seems to me that the British military is going to become much, much smaller, and therefore it's going to lose its impact. So I wonder if you could comment as to how you see Brexit, first on the strategic and political side of the EU, but more importantly, what NATO does next, because I fear this is going to be somewhat damaging.
Thanks. Eric?
Thank you. Eric Batberg from the McCain Institute. We're, of course, in Washington, and we're 1 month and 2 days away from a pivotal election in this country. Of course, America has traditionally played a leading role in Europe, supporting a more integrated Europe, a stronger Europe. What potential damage do you think a Trump presidency would mean for Europe? How would that impact Europe? Thank you.
And one more question. I think it's funny, as I was watching US TV getting ready, they're calling it a certain number of news cycles before the next, it's 30-something news cycles before the election, before the vote. I thought that was a funny way to describe it. Sir? And then anybody in the back for the next round?
My name is Javier Rupérez. I'm the former Spice ambassador here in Washington. A couple of questions. One is NATO and European defense. Because listening to the minister before, we've going back to that sort of rigmarole of, on one side, affirming the need for the European defense, but immediately saying, well, this is nothing to do against NATO. How are things right now? Because following the last summit meetings of the two organizations, you have the impression that things are getting better, but then you look into Bratislava and then something is going back to that sort of uncertainty about how to deal with NATO and the European defense. And certainly that seems to be one of the main aspects of the future. And the second question would be addressed to Mr. Rasmussen, because, well, he mentioned the fact that NATO is going to adapt to the new situation created by the aggression, the Russian aggression against Crimea. Does it mean that we are going to adapt even to the point of admitting the illegal annexation of Crimea? The fact that that illegal annexation is going to be there for quite some time, I'm afraid, that means that it's not going to affect the some sort of cooperation you mentioned before concerning NATO and Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another round after this. My panelists. Whoever wants to start. Anders, you want to?
Yeah, I think quite a number of questions were directed to me. First, on how will Brexit have impact on NATO? First of all, and in that respect also British investments in defense, it's my guess that the UK government, despite what I would consider long-term economic challenges, will do what it can to live up to the 2% commitment. And not least after Brexit, because NATO will now be the prime international organization for the UK. The UK has already promised to stay above 2% in defense investment. I wouldn't be surprised if the current government would put extra effort in an attempt to demonstrate an international commitment through more than 2%, but let's see, at least 2%. So that's a concrete impact on defense investments. I think that won't be the big problem. However, having said that, I see a lot of political strategic problems in the Brexit. Firstly, for the UK, apart from the economic challenges, the UK will lose a lot of influence, and you will soon realize how much you have lost. But for the European Union, it's equally deteriorating. One thing, of course, is the British contribution to the EU budget. But much more importantly, the UK has so far contributed to a global perspective in EU policies. We will now be lacking that global perspective. And on top of that, you have the euro crisis, you have the immigration crisis, the need for reforms. All that will force the European Union to be more inward-looking and less outward-looking. So the United States will miss an important partner on the global scene. So I see that as a real strategic challenge. Now, on NATO and European defense, it was with disbelief I read reports from Bratislava when I saw that European leaders spent so many hours, and what came out of it was just something about European defense. Of course, if all that talk about European defense reflected a will to increase defense investments, then I would applaud it. But it was about new headquarters in Brussels. I mean, during my term as Secretary General of NATO, we reduced the number of NATO headquarters from 11 to 7. Now they're speaking about building a new EU headquarters in Brussels. I don't understand it, but still, I don't think, honestly speaking, we will never see that realized. I don't think so. All speak about European defense will remain a paper tiger, So let's focus on real security challenges, and the fact is NATO is the only show in town when we are speaking about hard security, and will remain so for many years. I think, no, I've got one more question about adaptation. But I haven't spoken in very clear terms if I have been misinterpreted as if I wanted us to recognize the legal annexation of Crimea into the Russian Federation. The West will never, ever, never, ever recognize that illegal annexation of Crimea into Russia, just like we never recognized the legal annexation of the 3 Baltic states into the Soviet Union. We never did so. And eventually they became free and independent. So it's also a question of strategic patience, and that's exactly what we should demonstrate vis-à-vis Russia.
Both Anna and Miroslav, you were, he was shaking his
I
head.
was nodding.
Oh, you were nodding. Oh, it was, okay.
I agree. I think that NATO is the only show in town. If we just have some memory, and Ambassador Rupert remembers that because this is when I had the honor to serve as Foreign Affairs Minister, and he was ambassador here in Washington. We have to trace back this idea of just crystallizing a European defense to this moment of the run-up to the Iraq war, where Europe was split in two between the Atlanticists and the ones that wanted to have a counterweight, a counterpower, or a counter something to the United States. And this threat, you can never forget it. I was surprised by the Bratislava declaration. I fully agree with what Secretary Rasmussen has said. This is just paper. And again, why this declaration? Because the European heads of state and government needed areas where to say something that was launching a perception that there was appetite for more Europe. And this defense area, just having headquarters in Brussels was what was, you will know better, but I wasn't there, but I would bet that this was part of the equation. I think that there is there are two big problems besides the investment of 2%. One is that Europeans accept the complementarity. We cannot have a naval force and, and refueling. The Europeans should agree. They will not. They will not in the sense of giving up to have it in Europe. The best you can get is the coordination through NATO. Second, we don't even agree on what the threats are. Ask an Italian or ask a Spaniard if they think that Russia is a threat. They will tell you no. I would even go beyond. We have a different idea of what an army is for. In some countries in the European Union, unfortunately this is proliferating, the idea of the citizen of the army is that the army is for building schools and helping to rebuild roads or bridges or things like that, not to engage in armed confrontation. So I think that we have to say loud and clear that NATO is what unites us and that we have to stand by it and just forget about these chimeras, sorry, but these...
Anna, don't do that.
That we from time to time, from different angles, we just bring back to the fore. Now, on Trump, what for me is the worst? Uncertainty. Uncertainty. The day after there is a president here, all the world will just hold its breath. And us Europeans, frankly, we have known other heads of government that had some characteristics, but where Trump really wins by far. And I'm thinking of an Italian Presidente del Consiglio. Trump is much more than what is President of the Consiglio. And the issue there is really that the unexpected has always to be expected, from a photo opportunity to whatever. And this United States we cannot afford that the United States becomes unpredictable because I belong to those that think that you have a leadership role to fulfill. And from a leader, the first thing that you want is that the leader is predictable, frankly.
And now the inside story on what happened at the Bratislava summit on this agenda item. But also we should also remind everyone that at the same time as they're talking about possibly building this new headquarters, at the NATO summit this year, the EU and NATO signed more agreements to work together, more practical agreements on sharing intelligence, sharing, I mean, they're going to have daily intelligence meetings, bump those up. So, I mean, while they may be talking about these things on a practical level, they are doing more together. I believe more agreements were signed on one day in Warsaw than cumulatively up till that point between the EU and NATO.
But that's acknowledging the role of NATO.
Exactly, but that's what I'm saying.
That's acknowledging, not replacing, not having a different approach. It's just acknowledging that NATO brings a lot of things.
Exactly, I'm talking about the dichotomy between these two visions, that they're going to build an EU army, but at the same time, they're acknowledging that NATO is going to play some roles and the EU is going to play some roles, and everybody has different strengths.
There is no need to worry. There will be no European army, there will be no European headquarters. In the immediate aftermath of the British referendum, some member states revived their old dreams of European army. Some non-papers were presented, but as an insider, as someone who was taking part in the Bratislava meeting, I can tell you that this was certainly not in the center of attention. That part of Bratislava paper was drafted in Brussels, and it was still there, but leaders spoke much more about the common vision, about unity, about the economy, about terrorism. And after the summit, last week, we had a meeting of EU ministers of defense with the presence also of the current Secretary General of NATO. And it was very clear that there is no appetite whatsoever for building any parallel European defense structures. So I would say that the issue has all but evaporated. And what we need to do is, of course, to strengthen the common security and defense policy of the European Union, which is there, to implement the EU global strategy, to implement the EU-NATO declaration, which was signed at the NATO summit in Warsaw, and to avoid any duplications. So whatever we do, it must be in complementarity. And I fully agree with the Secretary General that our first priority as EU and NATO members should be, of course, to to implement our commitment when it comes to the 2%. Our security comes from NATO, and this will not change. So there was much ado about very little, if anything, I must say.
Maybe it's the journalist's fault. That's what
And the truth is that
we could write about.
No. I mean, it was mentioned, but I always fail to see any logic in speaking about the defense, because our people don't worry about lack of defense. They really worry about lack of their security in the wake of terrorist attacks. They like about the economy. They like about our inability to deal with migration issues. But I never heard any of normal, ordinary citizens speaking about lack of defense. So it was a wrong answer to Brexit and to the challenges EU is facing.
Do they worry about a Trump presidency not coming to the aid of an Eastern European ally in the case of a necessary Article 5?
It's for you, for independent analysts, to speculate. I'm the sitting foreign minister, so I must be politically correct. And it's no, I have to. I mean, everybody's tweeting in this room. So what I can say is that it's for you to elect the president, and it's for us to work with the president of the United States and wait for the program. So I obviously we follow with interest, but I am certainly not here to make any comments.
Do they talk about it in the margins of the council meetings?
Of course, everybody does. A lot.
Very interesting. Ambassador.
Yeah, can I make a couple of points in response to the questions that were raised? Last year, when I was still the ambassador here, I remember we'd had quite a lot of sometimes very robust, as we say in the jargon, debate about the 2%, about the UK's commitment, about whether the UK, having been host to the NATO summit in South Wales, was actually going to do its bit to ensure that it did 2% and remained a serious player in terms of capabilities. And we recommitted to the 2%. I don't think, despite the fiscal difficulties that there will be in terms of lower tax receipts in the short term, that the British government is going to resile from the commitment which it gave very loud and clear last year after the NATO summit. We've got £150 billion of new equipment program over the next decade, new aircraft carriers, new frigates, new maritime patrol aircraft, a whole lot of different things which the UK is doing. And I think this is an area where, to quote Boris Johnson, the UK will be leaving the European Union but not leaving Europe. We will continue to take our NATO commitments extremely seriously. And there's a whole lot of other areas, not just defense, but cybersecurity, intelligence, counterterrorism, those sort of issues, police work, where the United Kingdom will remain, I believe, a strong and important and credible and useful partner for a lot of our European colleagues and allies and friends outside the framework of the existing, if you like, EU structures. So I don't think people should worry about that, although it is quite right to think that there are going to have to be some tough times in terms of budgets. Philip Hammond, my old boss, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, has been warning this week that there is going to be a need for discipline in terms of public spending, especially running costs, but he's also been saying that we've got to find the money while money is cheap to invest in essential infrastructure for the future, which would also help ensure that employment levels remain healthy. So I think those things are going to be important, and I'm rather hoping, Mr. Secretary General, that you're wrong that there is going to be a kind of UK loss of influence. We're not giving up on diplomacy, we're not giving up on defense, we're not giving up on foreign policy more generally. We have, I like to think, a pretty effective global diplomatic network and a number of relationships and issues where the UK has in the past and will continue to make a significant contribution. Last thing, I failed to answer your question about the listing of immigrants working in British companies. I should have picked that up. It created a firestorm on the media. This is one suggestion.
15 minutes left.
This is one suggestion which the Home Secretary mentioned, that companies would be asked to mention those on their workforce who are not UK nationals. This is partly about identifying weaknesses. It's one of several suggestions. It's not about naming and shaming. And she also made clear in interviews this week, the Home Secretary, that taking back control of immigration and frontiers and so on did not mean to say bringing down the shutters. It meant looking at the needs and ensuring that those people who come into the UK from the EU and indeed from elsewhere are those who we need to have in the British economy. It was not a shut-off point, and it was one of several suggestions which I think might have given alarm to foreign investors, especially those who need to have people from outside the UK to ensure that those investments are truly effective. It may have given them some alarm, but I think it might have been a little misunderstood.
But these are people who already have jobs. I mean,
yes, I mean the British government's
evidently
view,
somebody thought they were needed.
The British government's view on this is that those EU citizens, of which there are 2.9 million in the UK, who are there ought to be allowed to stay. We'd like them to stay, but of course we will be looking for, the British government, which I no longer represent, will be looking for reciprocal guarantees for British citizens living elsewhere in the EU. That ought to be an area that is relatively uncontroversial.
So you think it's being overwritten or overplayed or?
Well, I can understand why people got alarmed about it, because it's in its party conference season, it's a political issue. But as Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, said, this is but one of a number of issues that we're looking at.
Okay. All right, I'll let the audience pick that up if they want. Okay, yes. And a lady's hand over there, 1, 2, and right here, the young guy. Okay, so those 3 questions for the next round, and if we hurry, we can maybe take one more.
Thank
I've
you.
been given till 12:15.
Ed Verona with McClarty Associates. One of the now emerging divisive issues within the EU is energy security. The EU has an energy policy. It calls for the diversification of supply, particularly of natural gas. It has an instrumentality, if I can recycle that unlovely term, which is a third energy package, which calls for unbundling, in the case of natural gas, the production, distribution, and marketing of it, the transmission. I understand, Minister, that your government is one of 8 countries which has signed a letter to the Commission saying that it opposes the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would provide gas from Russia. And yet the Vice Chancellor of Germany, in a conversation which I don't think he intended to be public, said, don't worry, to the Russians, don't worry about this issue. Germany will assume responsibility for energy policy with respect to Nord Stream. How is this issue likely to be resolved? And maybe Ms. Palacio, you could also say a word or two in your capacity as a board member of a major natural gas company. Thank you.
There's a young lady. Yes.
My name is Denisa Pacholska. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins University. My question is about Brexit and what effect will Brexit have on the relations between the US and the UK?
Hello, my name is Ryan, and I'm a French student currently here on an exchange. We've been talking, and rightfully so, about union and alliances since this morning. So I want to address the topic of disunion. Firstly, how will Brexit affect a Scotland that has a majority voted for Remain and comes back from a referendum on its independence that was pretty much a close call? And Minister Ana Palacio, how could that affect an entity such as Catalonia, for example, in Spain? I've got a second short question, which is if you could speak about the damage or potential damage that a successful Brexit, in which the United Kingdom grows stronger and more prosperous, affects more Eurosceptical countries. Thank you very much.
The rash of exits. Yes, sir, we'll take one more.
I'm the Dutch Defense Attaché. The question is on the EU-NATO cooperation. I should write it. Okay. Commodore Tenaf, I'm the Dutch Defense Attaché. The question is on the EU-NATO cooperation. We see now with current and future threats that they go beyond NATO alone or EU alone. So there is a need for cooperation. You refer to Warsaw. A lot of agreements were being signed. But all these agreements need to be implemented. There will be new challenges. How does the panel regard the risk that Brexit will take away too much attention and focus EU internal? And will EU and NATO be responsive enough to address the external threats?
That's important, and I think as an Atlantic Council event on the margins of the Warsaw Summit pointed out, the Norwegian foreign minister said, we're spending all of our time, and he's not even an EU member, the European Union is spending all of its time looking at its navel, thinking about Brexit. What about ISIS? What about, we haven't even talked about ISIS here. The threat of homegrown terrorism, humongous, living in Brussels. Our life is different. Our army, the Belgian army, is used to patrol the streets, to stand outside metro stations. I mean, we haven't even talked about that on this panel as challenges because we're talking about Brexit. And is that even appropriate? Is that an appropriate use of time and concern? Okay, now all of those 4 questions. To anybody who wants them? Yes?
Yeah, I think the last question is the key question, speaking about the relationship across the Atlantic. Now, I mentioned what I don't think is the appropriate answer to the current EU crisis. Now I will try to mention just in headlines what I do believe would be the appropriate answer. First of all, I think the EU needs to carry through profound reforms. Firstly, to strengthen the external border control, because you cannot uphold the internal free movement of labor, for instance, if you do not trust the external border control. In concrete terms, I would suggest this is an area where we need more EU, namely an EU-managed external border control. That's the first issue. Secondly, I think we should carry out profound welfare reforms, and the core here should be give easier access to jobs, restrict access to welfare benefits. Because in Europe we need more labor. But today it's too difficult to get a job, it's too easy to get welfare benefits. We should reverse that. And thirdly, we should also carry out necessary labor market reforms, including comprehensive liberalization of the labor markets. In certain countries, it's much too difficult for employers to hire and fire people. In Denmark, you can just hire and fire, which means that employers also, they're also more inclined to actually to employ young people. So comprehensive reforms of the EU, that's necessary. But on top of that, I think we should strengthen the transatlantic relationship. We have spoken already on security. The Europeans should invest at least 2% of GDP in defense. Secondly, I think we need an economic NATO in parallel with the security NATO. And the core here should be a quick finalization of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, which is in a stalemate right now. I hope a new administration on this side of the Atlantic. I hope the European authorities on the other side of the Atlantic will move forward on that. And thirdly, we also need to strengthen the people-to-people contacts across the Atlantic, exchange programs, etc. So I think profound reforms of the EU plus a strengthened transatlantic partnership, that's exactly what we need.
Did you want to talk about that? The new EU border guard actually is implemented as of today, as a matter of fact, while we're sitting here.
Yeah,
so congratulations.
One of the successes of Slovakia's presidency in the European Union. No, we had it as one of our priorities, by the way, because yes, yeah, we believe it's a right move, and it's really important, and it's good that we speak about protection of borders as one of most important elements of dealing with migration issues. Yes.
But it's not an overall EU-managed border control.
No, not yet, not yet. But it's still a big leap forward for us. I may answer the question on energy policy.
Yeah. Which is something else that the EU could talk about as a success, and often doesn't. It's not quite sexy enough.
Not yet, because we would like to achieve a situation when we can speak about energy union. Energy union means that EU acts as one. We are the biggest customer when it comes to energy, but we are not being treated as such because we don't act as one. And
by Russia?
Yes, yes, and by others as well. It could help us to save money, and of course the goal is for each of the EU member states to have at least 3 options of the provider and also of routes. Right now we are fighting against each other, let's face it, Nord Stream, South Stream. So it's about the selfish interest of individual member states who don't care about the interests of other member states. And the Nord Stream 2 project is just the confirmation of this hypocrisy. Because it cannot be called a business project, just an ordinary, regular business project when your partner on the Russian side is Gazprom. So you are saying that Gazprom is just ordinary business company with no political strings attached, right? That's what we all believe. Second, there is no economic justification for that because the current infrastructure is being used up to 50%. So and there is no increase in demand projected. So you are going to build another pipeline to deliver the same volume of gas. What for? Is it going to increase or lower our dependence on one provider? And of course, politically, it's damaging, because it was said officially that the main purpose of this project is to bypass Ukraine. So which means to deprive Ukrainian state budget of more than 2 billion euros a year. Slovakia will be a collateral damage, because we are going to lose like 800 million from the transit. But what shocks me is that it's not on the agenda, because simply we pretend it's an ordinary business project. And we are saying about how much we need to support Ukraine, and we have introduced sanctions against Russia, and at the same time, this project is being developed and will be completed, that's my guess, because no one will stop it. So I don't know what message are we sending about ourselves, about how credible we are, and about how honest we are as partners.
I'm thinking you're very honest today, and I love it. I wish I could tweet all this stuff as we talk.
Probably that's why I was not elected the second.
You're freed of that burden now. No, it's really interesting. I mean, honestly, I just have to remark on how frank and how interesting, how educational this is for me, who covers this stuff every single day. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have 2 remarks. One on the things that I think that are in the future for the European Union. It's not TTIP, unfortunately. I don't see it until we approach these internal reforms that we need. One of the main issues in Europe, one of these legitimacy issues, is the left behind. And this, Theresa May addressed it, and she's right. I mean, again, the diagnostic is right. So I don't see realistically the TTIP going forward. But I think there are 3 areas that have mentioned. One is energy union. There is a demand from the citizens to have more security of supply and just diversity of sources and of routes. That's clear. So there we have the digital agenda. We will go forward. I fully agree with Secretary Rasmussen that securing our external borders is another area where we will go forward. And I said before that I don't see that appetite in classical internal market areas. Frankly, I don't see, but I see it in these 3 areas. On Nord Stream, just telegraphically, of course, this was a political issue, and I would say, with opaque aspects, as for instance, a legal opinion that was leaked that frankly is no legal, I don't know if an opinion, but certainly not legal according to EU law. My last conversations in Brussels were quite reassuring that this will be at least postponed for the moment. At a certain moment, we thought that it was going to have a green light, and it's not going to be tomorrow, which in the European Union, we muddle through. This is our motto. But we muddle through, and it's not that bad. And in this area, on Catalonia, the drivers of Catalonia, just nationalism and secessionism, are purely internal. Frankly, don't look at just external influences. Are purely internal, historical, long time, and I'm happy to discuss this, but this will bring us to a different conversation. And last, but it's on this. I really would bet on the energy security. There have been great things that have been done by the European Union, and you are absolutely right. We are not heralding what we have achieved. There is a lot. The gas package is extremely interesting, and there is a lot that is on progress. So, I mean, just to put certain note of optimism, there are areas where Europe is in demand, concrete areas, and where things are happening. Muddling through, yes, but happening.
Muddling through together. Ambassador Westmacott, also on the Scottish question, I mean, I think that's been sort of dealt with in the press and by the Scots themselves, but if you could bring us up to date on anything new.
On Scotland, I would just say that there isn't any sign at the moment we're going to have another referendum in Scotland. It was one of the concerns before the referendum vote that if Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay in the European Union, which it did, Scots did, that there would be irresistible pressure for another referendum for Scotland to leave the UK after that event. It doesn't at the moment feel like that. Scottish political leaders are saying we have to do what is best for Scotland and so on. But I think the key thing to remember is that when the last referendum was held, and the gap in the end was 45-55, it was a 10-point gap in favor of keeping the United Kingdom intact. That was a time when the price of crude was $140 a barrel. It is a great deal less now. So the economics of going it alone for Scotland have become a good deal more difficult, coupled with the fact that there is not exactly a chorus of enthusiasm from elsewhere in the European Union to admit Scotland quickly as an independent state on its own to the EU. So at the moment it seems to me that the mood for another referendum, and of course nobody's going to want to push for a referendum unless they're sure they're going to get a different result, but I think the sense at the moment is this is not for tomorrow, this is not for the near future, and we need to engage as a whole United Kingdom in trying to make a success of the Brexit thing. So I don't think that's on the political agenda for the very near future, but let's see how the negotiations go. Then I should try to answer briefly the question, what does Brexit mean for the US-UK relationship? I think the answer at the moment is that the United States, of course, has not changed its view that Brexit was not a good idea. They would rather have the European Union strong, with the United Kingdom a strong member of an outward-looking, competitive, credible partner for the United States. President Obama made that pretty clear when he came back to the UK in April. But equally, I think that the policy messaging that I am hearing from my friends is we want to work with you to try to, as they might say, mitigate the damage, but to make a success of this so that it is as good for Europe and as good for NATO and transatlantic security and prosperity as we can make it. I think there's a sense of not over-engineering the different options of the way in which the Brexit negotiation might end, because frankly, the British government, never mind our European partners, are not clear at this point, other than that we wish to activate this Article 50 process by the end of March. For the rest of it, we don't know how it's going to come out, and there's a lot of loose talk about whether there will or won't be compromises on freedom of movement, whether there will or won't be access to or membership of the single market. All that has yet to be resolved. And I sense that people here in Washington are waiting for that to play itself out, but in the meantime focusing on the many other areas which remain very strong parts of the bilateral relationship, the investment, the defense, the intelligence, the agency working, the counterterrorism, lots of other things, cybersecurity, where the UK and the United States, along with a lot of other European partners, need to continue to work effectively. So I think at the moment, that seems to me the mood at the present time.
Well, that's a good place. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. For our next speaker is going to be EU Ambassador David O'Sullivan, who will come to the stage now. But I just want to thank my panel. You have been so interesting. I'm really delighted. It was really a privilege to be here with all of you, whom I have covered in one way or another over the years, and I'm just really flattered to have been here. Thank you to Atlantic Council, and thank you to our great audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You were so fun.
Thank you.
So in Brussels now, you have to always call on me when I'm in the back of the room, right?
Yeah, sure.
Before you go, I have just started following you on Twitter.
Yeah?
But before you go, give me your card. Because I have a lot in common. You know who's a really good friend of mine, Christina Cole? Yeah, of course. She's my really close personal friend for years, for 15 years. So when she left, I sort of, I'm not in touch with everybody. I will give you my card. I'd love to support women in international security too. Do you do the WE stuff? Do you do the women in, not formally? Nucleus.
Yes, absolutely, I will. Thank you so much, Dean.
Please, if I may, if I could ask folks just to step down. We're going to turn to Ambassador David O'Sullivan to close us out, please. So.
Well, thank you very much, Damon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It falls to me to make some closing remarks. As soon as we can just get a little bit of quiet in the corner of the room, there you are. I appreciate it's been a long morning and a very, very interesting and invigorating discussion, so I'm not going to take a very long time other than to just make some comments. Firstly, a very warm thank you to the Atlantic Council, particularly to Fred Kemp and the Future of Europe initiative with Damon for organizing this conference, which I think is really very timely. I'd like to also very warmly thank the Slovak presidency for co-hosting it and working on it, particularly, of course, Miroslav Lajcek, the minister who was just here, but also my good colleague, Peter Kmek, the ambassador. I think this was really a very good and timely moment to have this discussion, and I think the last panel, which I was privileged to overhear much of, showed just some of the complexity of the questions which we have at this point. some of us have noticed that you're having an election here in the United States. Some of you Americans may have noticed that we're having one or two discussions in Europe about our future. And clearly, you know, some of the certainties which were there before, whether this is the benefits of globalization or free trade, are up for question and up for criticism on both sides of the Atlantic. And we need to figure out how we're going to react to that and how we're going to still maintain this very strong partnership. John Kerry said it last Tuesday in Brussels that unity in Europe and EU-US relations are indispensable to global security and prosperity. And he added that the world has become less hierarchical and power is more broadly shared, which I think is a very true description of what we've just been listening to. And as High Representative Federica Mogherini said in New York in September, the US deserves and needs strong and reliable partners like the EU. I think it's very clear. What I sometimes like to say myself is that the days when agreement between the United States and Europe on any given issue was a sufficient condition to move the global dial are long since gone. There are too many other actors. As the Secretary of State has said, the world has become less hierarchical, more broadly shared. I still continue to believe that agreement between the United States and Europe is a necessary condition to actually influence events. And that is why I think this partnership remains very, very important. And over the past years, I think the European Union has shown our capacity to act as a global security provider. The US, as we know, cannot respond to all security and global challenges alone. And that's why we've spent so many efforts chairing the Iran talks, for example, pushing for a global agreement to tackle climate change, or leading our many security and defense missions abroad. And we will do even more in the years to come, including in the field of security defense, which I know was discussed in the previous panel. The US and NATO have a lot to gain from a strong European Union, and I think the joint declaration which we signed last July with NATO at the Warsaw Summit shows our commitment to step up our efforts to address issues like hybrid threats. And we will remain outward-looking and strengthen our role as a security provider. But there are also other priorities on which we will focus so as to build a better Europe, a Europe that protects, empowers, and defends. This was the title of President Juncker's State of the Union address. And as the President at that time said, it's time to roll up our sleeves and double, triple our efforts. Europe needs more determined leadership than ever. And I think Fred Kemp's opening remarks echoed some of that this morning. It's clear, you know, I always used to say when I was Secretary General of the European Commission and talking to the staff who sometimes would get a bit depressed about the fact that not everyone loved Europe or that we were criticized, I used to say it's easy to be a European official when things are going well. The real challenge of the commitment of European officials to European integration is when the going is tough. And when you actually have to try to get out there and sell this enterprise, demonstrate the value added, demonstrate that we can actually make a difference to people's lives. That's when our role is actually most important. When everything is going very well, it's relatively easy. And by the way, I want to pick up on something someone said. One of the questions talked about that there was energy security was an issue on which there was divisions in Europe. Well, yes, because it's political. And we're a political union. You have divisions in the United States on many issues, and you don't regard it as divisive. You simply say that's your politics. Our politics is exactly that. We have 28 member states still, and there are differing views, there are differing perspectives, and the whole point, as Anna Palacio said, is that the European Union provides the vehicle for how we compress and massage those differing views into, finally, a common position. It's not always elegant, it's not always beautiful, the process by which we do it, but we achieve it. And it's one of our great successes. And I think that is the great success of the European Union, which we have to try to preserve, including always trying to persuade our citizens that this is actually done in their best interest, which is something which I admit is sometimes challenging. So I think the priorities set out by President Juncker, reminding us again, growth and jobs, that we have to invest and create an economy which is competitive, which is capable of providing an economic future for our citizens. We need to do more for the youth, for the unemployed, the middle class, the small businesses. I mean, the left behind, I think was the phrase I heard used by the panel. We know there's a general sentiment in our societies across the Atlantic that somehow our economy is not delivering for everyone in our society, and that the benefits of globalization, of trade, of openness, of liberalized economic economic policies, which we have been the sort of consensus for so many years, are now being challenged by people saying, well, actually, that may deliver for you, the elite, or some people, but it's not delivering for me. And we have to address that issue as to how we find ways to make sure that everyone benefits from that. We have to be clear about what we can do to for example, addressing the refugee issue, the investment plan for Africa, trying to address the issue of migration and asylum seekers at root cause, and trying to facilitate countries keeping their people at home. And that was a very important investment plan which we've launched of cooperation with the African countries. We need to look at the issue of digitalization, the digital single market, which I think is a hugely ambitious project, which has enormous benefits for Europe, but by the way, I think ultimately enormous benefits transatlantically, even if sometimes it's going to cause a little bit of friction, and I find myself in the forefront of that from time to time. And we will have to defend our borders, external borders, in a more effective way, and we are launching today, as has already been mentioned, the Border and Coast Guard. Once again, I mean, this is something which, frankly, 2 years ago, if you'd said, could you imagine a European Border and Coast Guard, people would have said, of course not. And now we've done it. And I know Fred sometimes this morning painted some of the challenges facing Europe, and he's right to remind us of the fact that we live in difficult and challenging times. But sometimes we must also celebrate what we actually achieve and the things that we get done, and this is one very, very concrete example. So I think that we now need to think about how we're going to go forward in relation to the future of the European Union, as has been mentioned. The Bratislava summit, I think, was a first discussion. It will be continued in Valletta again in January, February, and moving on to Rome in March to commemorate, among other things, the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Rome. And once again, with all modesty, without any complacency and without being Pollyanna-ish about this, let's just look how far we have come since 1958, when we started with 6 countries in the immediate aftermath of 2 bloody wars and the Holocaust. That's the state that Europe was in 1958. And while we have many challenges today, we are now 28 member states. We have provided safe haven for the countries coming out of totalitarianism, Greece and Spain and Portugal. We have reunited the continent in 2004 with the first big enlargement of the former Soviet Union countries, and then the subsequent accession since then. We have provided an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity and tranquility in Europe. Frankly, we may look back on this as a golden age when we compare some of the challenges we are facing into the future. We should not lose sight of this, I respectfully suggest, and we should be willing actually to explain just how much of this, not all of it, but how much of it is due to what we've been able to achieve through the European Union. We need to address the issue of our external frontiers, which is going to be very important. We need to address challenges of internal security and terrorism, and we need, as has been said already, to do more on the area of assuming responsibility for our own security and defense in our region. So we have a very clear roadmap and a large number of concrete steps, and this will be taken forward in the coming months. Of course, against this backdrop, we have the British decision on Brexit. We know this, but as Peter Westmacott has already said, I think this is going to take some time. And I know everyone would love to jump to conclusions and have the answers immediately. We're going to have to let this evolve. The British government's going to have to take its position. Article 50 is going to have to be triggered. There will be negotiations. So this is going to be, we're going to have to live with this uncertainty for some time. And I think it should not distract us from the fact that we also have a very important agenda to be getting on with, as set out in Bratislava and in the State of the Union speech by President Juncker. So my conclusion is that the EU and the US will remain the backbone, the essential partners, as Vice President High Representative Mogherini has said. And the phrase I love to quote is Vice President Joe Biden's phrase from the Munich Security Conference of, I think now, last year, to say that we are each other's best friends of first resort. I think that sums up our mutual sense of values, our commitment to democracy, to the rule of law, to the defense of human rights. This is what unites us more than anything else. These things are going to be challenged in the 21st century by others. We need to work very closely together and maintain our partnership to continue to defend those values which have given so much to both our regions in the last 50 or 60 years. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sullivan. That was a fantastic way to bring our day to a close. I just wanted to conclude our conversation by saying thank you to all of you. Thank you especially, Ambassador Sullivan, to the EU and your full team, Caroline and colleagues, to the Slovak presidency as well, Ambassador Kimmets. It's pretty clear from what you said, Ambassador, and to others, that we're living through historic times. And I think we feel pretty passionately that when Europe has worked together and North America has worked with Europe, history's actually gone a little bit better. And in these times today, we think it's quite important that we have North America and Europe working together, not to just be buffeted by historic developments, but to actually help shape that future. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council, we thank you and your teams. And I also want to give a shout out to the Atlantic Council team. Thank you to Simona, to Susan, to Amanda, to Rachel, to Paul, Victoria, the whole team of interns from our Future Europe and Global Business, Marie, others who helped make today possible. And we look forward to having you back here for the next installment of this debate. Thank you.